and all things gender. The Religious Leader Symposium is the Army Chaplain Corps' premier strategic education and leader development forum, and we have a real treat in store for us today. But first, I'd like to recognize our special guests and our Chaplain Corps leadership. Please hold your applause until the end. General Thomas Siemens, we've already seen him here, the Army G1. Dr. Snider, who will speak shortly, soldier, scholar, and professor of profession and ethics. Arriving later, Rabbi Lappin and his wife Susan, Dr. Gifford Gropin and Dr. Janet Smith, and our own Chaplain Corps leadership, Chaplain Hurley, Chief of Chaplains, Chaplain Soljum, Deputy Chief of Chaplains Active Component, and his wife Jill, Chaplain Plaskowski, Deputy Chief of Chaplains U.S. Army Reserve, Sergeant Ralph Martinez, Chaplain Corps Regimental Sergeant Major, and his wife Laura. Thank you for your presence and your participation. Thanks for coming. Okay, I'm Jonathan Shaw, Director of Operations. Let's get started. Religious support and all things gender. How do we as a Chaplain Corps provide religious support within the profession of arms against the backdrop of a society adrift in a sea of dysphoria regarding gender, sexuality, human relationships, and purpose? Consider the 4 news stories from the last 2 weeks. 1, the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service just released its interim report considering whether selective service registration and any draft should include women. The document generally emphasized including women in requirements, but one dissenting voice was quoted. "This civilization depends on the nurturing, loving influence that women bring to the public discourse and to the business of raising a healthy citizenry." 2, the American Psychological Association just defined, quote, traditional masculinity as, quote, a pathological state marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, on the whole harmful, end quote. But the truth is that masculine traits such as aggression, competitiveness, and protective vigilance not only can be positive, but they have biological basis and are helpful for the military's mission. 3, the Supreme Court just intervened on behalf of the Trump administration, allowing restrictions on military service by transgender individuals. Gender identity may be reset against biology by Giersmarkers, but eligibility is limited. 4, Mrs. Pence, the wife of the Vice President, was excoriated by elements of the press for planning to teach art part-time at Emmanuel Christian School in Northern Virginia. She was labeled a bigot for affiliating with a school that teaches marriage as a one-man, one-woman permanent union taught in Scripture. Which brings us to RLS 4, religious support and all things gender. We are here to think deeply on issues of gender support, undergird our personal religious integrity and identity, and find wise and faithful ways of bringing soldiers to God and God to soldiers in all things gender. We must listen to each other, learn, and discuss the tensions that exist. If we cannot speak respectfully and candidly here, we will fail out there. So, freedom of religion is the first freedom, both in degree and in precedence. We are religious supporters, bound to our ordination oaths and ecclesiastical endorsements for how we preach, teach, pray, and counsel. And for us, this necessarily eclipses gender policies. But simultaneously, we are members of the profession of arms bound to its policy requirements, and if we cannot perform this support, then we must provide or refer, because the welfare and care of soldiers and families is our honorable duty. As senior leaders, we must chart the course. There are other tensions. Free exercise of religion for soldiers and families requires expression and respectful dialogue in the public square, not just behind closed, locked chapel doors. How do we express God's truth of human sexuality? Affirming moral empowerment and warning of that which is morally dangerous when a culture increasingly adrift rails against the very concept of truth. On the positive side, religious faith and natural law build a manly ethic of self-sacrifice on the battlefield and human care and nurture at home, and these are requirements for battlefield success for land power. Each of our guest speakers is incredible, providing key insights for us to think about. Dr. Snider on the profession of arms and trust. General Siemens on Army policy and care of soldiers. Dr. Grobin on the common good and theology of marriage. Rabbi Lappin on biblical concepts and biological realities. And Dr. Smith on the common sense of natural law. Our RLS 4 rules of engagement are important, and we need to honor them. 1, keep your integrity. 2, honor the team. 3, care for the soldier. 4, respect non-attribution. That means that we will not be taping the discussion sections following our presentations so that we can have a true, free, and open exchange of ideas. And with that, friends, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce a true soldier, statesman, expert in the Army profession and ethic, and a personal friend, mentor, and a living strategic leader icon, Dr. Dr Snider. Sir, you can lead us with
Am I audible in the rear?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Daunting task this morning to follow your chief of chaplains, who gave one of the most authentic discussions I've heard in a long time. Thank you, Paul. But I left his chart up because I want to follow it. He set the stage very well for what I want to discuss with you, what I've been asked to discuss with you. You are folks, as I have been throughout my career, who have been following dual callings on your life. You accepted a calling from God to be people of the cloth. At the same time, you've accepted a calling from the state to be a commissioned officer in the United States Army. It's not easy, authentically, to live a life of dual callings. The way we handle this at the War College and our fellowship, when we deal with the students and in fellowship with the students, help them understand at the strategic level that the pressures are going to become even greater now in following dual calling. That the great risk is to compartmentalize life. I'm a chaplain here, I'm a Christian layman here, I'm a commissioned officer here. The bifurcation of identity, the bifurcation of effort, the compartmentalization, and the absolute ruin of authenticity of leadership. Soldiers sense in a flash when the person leading them is not authentic. And that hasn't changed since my early days of direct leadership, when I will remind you, I was leading draftees who didn't want to be there. We fought a whole war and lost it with draftees who didn't want to be there. And one of the reasons we lost it is because of leadership. That's how armies succeed, and that's how armies fail. So this identity issue that your chief introduced is exceptionally important from an academic point of view. You clinicians in the audience and those with degrees in psychology will recognize what he was talking about this morning was social identity theory. Once a Marine, always a Marine. You know, it's not coincident that every armed forces uses identity theory in the development of their officer corps. Why do they do that? Because it works. Because the power of that, the theory documents the power of identity to produce motivation, which produces action. We didn't discuss very much yet in the conference the connection, the intervening variable. The intervening variable is personal motivation. And what social identity theory helps us understand is that if we can create the right identity in people, we just captured an immense amount of their personal motivation. Now they own the motivation to become who we want them to become. And that's critical to leadership. That's the difference between being a transactional leader and being a transformational leader. I'll come to that later. So this issue of who you are under your dual callings, how do you see yourselves, and therefore how you are personally motivated, is what I want to continue to address following on what your chief introduced to you. I want to focus on the part of your dual callings. I want to stay in my lane. I studied the military. I served in the military. So I want to talk about your responsibilities as commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers. And the emphasis is not on the former, it's on the noun, not the modifiers. You are officers of the state. You have not only fiduciary responsibilities to the state, those include moral responsibilities to the state. And so, it's nice to be welcomed back to this group to come and speak to you, but I want to be clear about what part I'm going to speak about. This is almost like for me coming back to a family reunion, for I know so many people here. And I've done so many of these, I now get introduced as Lazarus. But all that said, I'm delighted to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and to interact with you. Focused as I will on the side of your responsibilities as commissioned officers. So could I have my first slide? Next slide. I'm going to give you the logic up front, because I'm going to go through about 3 or 4 module presentations, but there's a logic to all of them. So I want you to know, just the way we taught cadets at West Point, bottom line up front, where am I going? 2 charts. My whole presentation and the logic will be on 2 charts. You can read it for yourself. I want to talk to you about Big Army. You serve within a corps, a profession within a profession. We're talking about your identity as leaders of your corps, but I want you up to about 3,000 feet now, very quickly, out of your corps. I want you to think about Big Army and what are you doing for Big Army as a corps? Because Big Army is struggling. Big Army will always struggle, but it is struggling uniquely now. We can get to some of that in the Q&A, but the point, the Army is struggling to create cultures and climates of trust, and it's not succeeding. Certainly not as well as it needs to. Do I need to move?
No, you were fine. You were fine.
Oh, okay. Okay. Professional climates and cultures of trust, multi-domain operations, and most importantly, the way the Army has decided, rightly, to deal with future combat operations, the essence of what the Army's for. Don't ever forget, folks, as strategic leaders, the Republic does not need an Army except for one reason. Quite often, senior leaders in the Army lose sight of that, but the only reason the Republic needs an Army is to keep the citizens safe. It's just that simple. So don't, allow strategic leaders to start diverging and think, oh, there's a lot of ways we're serving the society and helping them. They're all ancillary, folks. The main thing is the main thing. Insecure people want to be secure. That's why they pay big bucks to have defense forces. So we've said we've got to have cultures of trust. But cultures of trust can only be created in certain kinds of organizational environments. And what we've documented quite clearly, that cultures of trust can only be built in environments that have the markers of a profession and not the markers of a government bureaucracy. I'll come to that in detail in my discussion. And those, if you have the organizational markers that you need, you still have to have the leadership inside to create those markers, and those leaders have to be considered trustworthy by their followers. Now, we do a lot of surveys in the Army, and I'll show you some data later. We're not doing well in creating trustworthy leaders. We've defined trustworthy leaders in our new document, in our new doctrine, in your doctrine of the big Army. A trustworthy leader is one who documents the 3 C's in their life, every day, in their leadership actions. They are of competence, they are of character, and they are of commitment. All 3. But we're developing too few. Next chart. Go ahead. I think that is a marvelous opportunity for your branch. Because the area that we're doing the weakest in of the competence, character, and commitment is moral character. And who else is responsible for the development of the moral leadership of the Army? It's yours. This is opportunity amidst immense challenge. And that's the picture I want to paint for you today. So now I've got to go back and tell you a story and paint this picture one step at a time, but that's where I'm going. I want you to see yourselves as the leaders of a branch that has a unique opportunity to fit into the greatest need the United States Army has now. That's not a new need. This need has always been there. We've always struggled to have enough leaders of character, and we'll probably continue to struggle. You're not in the business where you ever have complete victory. Just as the Republic will never be totally secure in a hostile world. Security ebbs and flows. The needs on the Army ebbs and flows. We understand that. Each of us has to come in. We serve our period of time. We do the best we can, and we hand it on to those whom we've developed. So, let me start with a story. Next chart. I want to make a distinction between leadership and stewardship. Stewardship is a relatively new concept for the Army. It was first written into your doctrine in 2013. The Army's been around for 240 years, folks. That was only 5 years ago. So officially in our doctrine, we've never talked about stewardship, even though we have mouthed it in many different occasions in many different ways. But stewardship is different than leadership. It is leadership, but it's a unique form. One called to exercise responsible care over something entrusted. So what are you entrusted with? The security of the Republic. And to do that, the American people give you their sons and daughters. That's the fiduciary responsibility. In your doctrine, written, published twice now, 13 and 15, it's a fascinating story of why the Army never had doctrine before and what it meant to be a profession. How intellectually dishonest we were to write our little manuals and simply declare the Army is a profession. I mean, that for anyone who studies the sociology of professions, that's absolutely backwards. No institution in America gets to declare itself to be a profession. That's the privilege of the client. The client looks at the aspiring profession, and they will determine if a profession on one basis. Do I trust you? That's the currency of professions, is trust. So it's immense hubris for the Army to write manual year after year after year and simply declare it was a profession. That's reflected in the study of how episodically the Army has studied itself as a profession. We studied ourselves after we lost Vietnam in 1970, an immense study done at the Army War College, but it was truncated the professionalism of the officer corps only. A remarkably fine study that documented the ultra-bureaucratic behavior of the officer corps in Vietnam. Punching tickets with 6-month command tours. I won't give you all the details, but from 1970 we studied ourselves as a profession, and for 30 years after that we never studied ourselves as a profession. We simply declared during that period the Army as a profession. Now, it did reprofessionalize, and the height of that reprofessionalization I would consider the Battle of 73 Easting and the First Iraq War. or one armored cav troop decimated an Iraqi regiment. That was the apogee of the military technical competence of the Army. So we had reprofessionalized. So there was some reason for declaring ourselves to be a profession, but it was certainly not grounded in research. So when we started to renew the study of professions at West Point, we started in 1998, published the first book in 2002, the second in 2005, 2 more after that up to 2010. So in a decade, with scholars from multiple disciplines outside the academy, around the United States, some foreign scholars, we had reestablished the understanding of military professions and in the new sociology of professions, not Huntington and Janowicz. They were only partially correct. In the new sociology of professions, professions die. They go away. That's why you're going through a reform effort, to keep your profession alive. If you believe Janowicz, Huntington, you would think once a profession, always a profession. Not so. Professions die. When they die, what happens? They morph back to something else, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So anyway, you now have doctrine on profession, and when I'm teaching younger audiences, I don't need to remind you here, given your seniority and your experience. You take your oath of office, and it states the office I am about to enter. I hope the mental image in your mind has nothing to do with a physical room. It is a moral office, and it goes wherever you are. Spiritual leaders, stewards, servant leaders do not have physical offices. They have moral offices. And authentically, they bear that with them wherever they go. Next chart. So this is what, now I want to tell a story very quickly. What do professions do? There are a lot of misconceptions. But clearly, the first one's the most important. The only reason professions exist in Western democracies is that first statement. Societies must have things to survive and to flourish, and if they can't provide it themselves, they consider it expert work, and they'll allow someone in their society to come up and say, well, I will study and I will do that expert work. But I need autonomy to do it. I can't have someone looking over my shoulder and telling me how to do expert work. Incidentally, you just write a new document on multi-domain operations. Not from concept. You went from concept now, MDO, operations. This is operational doctrine. How many members of Congress wrote that? I mean, sometimes we rail at meddling, but notice where they don't meddle. Fortunately, they don't meddle in places they know absolutely nothing about. They trust you to get it right. And when you go to war, they trust you to make it work. And we've done that for 17 years in Afghanistan, and that's why they're so frustrated, because we haven't made it work. So I'm speaking forthrightly. The profession has immense challenges right now. So that's what professions are. They work with abstract knowledge. It takes years of study. They work on a trust relationship, and if that trust relationship holds, they're granted autonomy. But that doesn't always happen. What happened to the Army after the Aberdeen scandal? What happened to the Navy after the tailhook scandal? In the Army's case, in the next Authorization Act, Congress told you how to do basic training. They wrote in the Authorization Act how you were to house your soldiers and gave you rather explicit instruction. Tom, you may remember that. You're old enough to remember that. I'm certainly old enough. I really remember that. But it was embarrassing for the profession. It was just immensely embarrassing. What could be more embarrassing than consider yourself a profession, expert, granted autonomy to practice, and all of a sudden your client comes along and writes it down for you? We had lost the trust of the Congress. The status of a profession forever ebbs and flows. And we'll see in a moment what the critical issue is how it ebbs and flows. So that's what professions do. Next chart. But you're a unique profession. That earlier chart covers medicine, it covers accountancy, it covers the law, it covers theology, it covers academia. But this is what makes you special. You are a lethal profession. There's only 4 reasons the Republic needs soldiers. prepare to kill, and under right authority to kill. And since you're in the killing business, to prepare to die and when necessary to die for the mission. That's where you folks come in the special opportunity of your branch. Since we're in the killing and dying business, the authenticity of life is not far from the minds of most soldiers, particularly when they're deployed. When I was a cadet, I used to read all the history of the Second World War, the history of the Korean War, SLA Marshall Studies, foxhole spirituality, and I didn't know what to think about any of that at all until I got to Vietnam. My first tour, I was in Special Forces. We were advising the South Vietnamese Special Forces as they were training Chinese nuns to do trail watching. So we were doing night jumps up in the tri-border area, double canopy, no reserves, flying in Taiwanese sanitized C-47s that were left over from World War II. We didn't know within 3 miles of whether we had hit the place we were supposed to hit. So you go into the double canopy, do an Australian rappel, bury anything that might have been there, and then you find your pack and you're off on your own on a little mission. The loss rates on those, we were working for SOG, for the Special Operations Agency, better known as the CIA, but the loss rates on those missions were immense. Even the South Vietnamese couldn't stand the loss rates after about 4 months. But I learned very quickly 2 things. One thing about myself was I had a human spirit and knew what fear was. And I had to deal with personal fear in ways that I had never dealt with in my life. And the second thing I learned, the first real jump we made after the practice jumps, I was simply jumping as an advisor at that point. And the South Vietnamese were running the jump. And I'd been in the airborne for a while. I'd been to jump master school. I thought I knew what I was doing. And with the little red light in the back of the plane, I watched the jump master reach in his shoulder holster and pull out a 9mm and cock around in it. Now, I was raised on a farm. I'm a farm boy. I'm not the smartest guy on the block. But real quick, my mind said, that's not what American jump masters do. And then I thought, but he's the jump master, and I'm just the last person in stick. And then him. So, 2 and 2 became 4 very quickly. This was a question that we were given when we started the research, to renew the study of professions. This happened at what we used to know as Fort Lewis. I was in the old Army. We still call them forts then. You're now joint. You have new titles, new names. Marvelous place. We were interviewing folks, and we wanted to understand, what does the Officer Corps now think it means to be a professional? So we were doing symbologic research. We asked them to bring a symbol of professionalism, because if they bring a symbol, then we can talk about the symbol, and people who are uncomfortable talking about themselves, we can still find out in their minds, in their frames of reference, what do they really think about being a professional? So guess what happened? We had officers there who brought Smokey Bear hats, because they saw more professionalism in the non-commissioned officer corps than they did their own branch. Now that's not true of all branches. The cab folks still brought black hats, spurs. The special ops folks still brought green berets. This officer brought nothing. Came to the interview and said, well, we asked you to bring something so that we could discuss. Why didn't you bring anything? And here's the answer. How can I be a professional if there is no profession? He said, I look around every day and I'm living in a bureaucracy. I don't have much authority. There's no white time on my calendar. I'm told what to do. I'm criticized when I don't follow rules and SOPs. How can I be a professional if there is no profession? And what do you think the answer is? In a large number of cases, you're not going to be. You're not going to have the personal motivation to overcome the demotivation of the environment. Remember, soldiers and all of us, everyday act. The two central motivations on our actions are, one, who are we, our personal character, virtue ethics in your language, and the pressure of the environment. Those are the two principal things that determine human behavior. Your parents, you know this, you've been dealing with this, raising kids all the time. This is not, this is human psychology. It applies to the discussion of professions and institutions as well as it does to families. And what he was saying is, I'm overwhelmed by this culture and I cannot be a professional. Folks, we did some research. We looked around. Is there any history in the United States of professionals in any profession being developed in bureaucratic cultures? And the answer is no. It's characterological. Lions do not eat hay. Bureaucracies do not create professionals. Now, don't get me wrong, you can have many professionals after they have been developed serve in bureaucracies very well, and we need them to, because then they move the lever. And they cause highly bureaucratic organizations to behave much more like professions do as military professionals. So fill out the chart. Go ahead. It will fill. Go ahead. Oh, back up. I went too fast. So how do we make moral decisions? This is REST model. There are others, but this one is still considered one of the best. It's an iterative process. You're getting ready to make a discretionary judgment. In the moral component of that judgment, first you have to recognize the moral content. We can teach that in schools, moral sensitivity. We can help in that regard. Then you have to come to some frame of reference for the moral judgment. That's what you teach, you ethicists in the centers. You teach different means of making moral decisions by different judgmental processes. And then you arrive at the point of the individual intentions of the young professional decision maker. He now knows what the morally commendable act is. I'm that far in the reasoning process. And now enter the field of moral psychology, a new field that's only been in extent for probably 20 years now. What happens when we get to this point in the decision-making process? What is one of the last considerations that gets added before we actually decide and act? And in almost all cases, that last set of considerations have to do with what are called individual equities. Not personal, individual. Identity of the individual. So we start asking ourselves, well, how's this going to look on my unit? How's this going to look on the Army? How's it going to look on the chaplain's corps? And if some personal equities come in, what's this going to do for my career? And they come in late. And then we take the action. Now, do you understand why it's so important that we have leaders of high moral character? That we have character that can withstand this kind of analysis, that gets to the final stage, and that we create cultures in trust in which people struggling with this will not be overcome by the power of the environment? Next chart. So here's what it looks like. Character is the fulcrum. Folks, moral character is your business. The Army needs it, institutionally and individually. It's the fulcrum. And notice in black, moral courage versus moral cowardice. We're a little too politically correct right now in the Army. I have read very little on the subject of moral cowardice. I've heard it discussed, practically not at all. But it is a binary. You're either going to act with courage or you're going to act as a coward. And most of the moral cowards in the Army profession are standing as bystanders. And we wonder why we're having difficulty with sexual assault and sexual harassment. You cannot have a population of bystanders. They're not behaving professionally, either because their moral character has not been developed sufficiently, or, next chart, go ahead, chart, or they're being hammered by the environment and simply can't withstand the pressure of the environment. Can't withstand the pressure. So that's where Big Army is. In my perspective, as an observer of Big Army, I'm not here to say this is where the chaplain's corps is. Please do not interpret my comments. The CASAT research is on Big Army. And right now, the Army is transitioning to a very demanding environment with a very aggressive operational doctrine. And yet we all know that operational doctrine cannot work in the future unless we have leaders of high moral character who will develop climates in which good moral decision-making can occur. Of those two, which do you think is most powerful? Which do you think is most powerful? Should we work harder on developing the character of the individual? Should we work harder on changing the culture, creating climates of trust? What do you think? I assumed you would say character because you're from the branch that holds dear to the idea of virtue ethics. And well, you should. But I'm here to tell you you're wrong. The new field of moral psychology says that almost by a factor of 2 to 1, the institutional pressure will dominate individual character. And the more millennials and Generation Z come into the Army, the more that's going to be the case, because as they come into the Army, they are further away from the development of moral character than soldiers were in the past. We have a bigger task now in the business of moral development. If you want a marvelous book to read on this subject, Dan Early, Duke University, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. Fascinating book. Compelling. That's only one. The other, he's more of a behavioral psychologist. The economic psychologist, the field of psychology is fracturing now into so many different areas. Healthily, don't get me wrong. Fractured sometimes can sound pejorative. I didn't mean that. I mean, it's dividing into new fields as the knowledge is expanding. But folks, that's why I titled this thing, We Need Cultures of Trust, Climates of Trust. I don't want to denigrate the fact that you do good work, are doing good work, can do better work in the development of individual moral character, but we're developing a lot of individual moral character and sending it out only to have it absolutely hammered and overcome by the environments in which it's going. So, final chart. So that's my pitch. I don't think it's changed from the first chart. Stated a little more emphatically, a bureaucratic, compliance-based Army led by transactional leaders. I can just tell you, folks, you are not going to get there. So, you're the stewards. The followers of the Army cannot address this. Only the stewards. Let me give you another way to think about your role as the stewards. You control the big muscle movements of the Army. The big policy movements you control. That's not out at the installations. That's not out even at the commands. The Department of Army, sometimes I think they underestimate how utterly powerful they are. Because when the Department of Army moves the big muscle movements of the Army, all the rest of it has to respond. And that's the role of stewards. Army colonels, when I lecture